Hey there, and welcome back to my Wildermyth build guide series. As before, if you've been following along with any of these will be 20 to 30 minute crash course guides targeted at players looking to optimize for Walking Lunch, the hardest difficulty in the game, with the carved in stone modifier enabled. I'm just going to briefly show you what that might look like in any of these campaigns that you can select in the game. If you go into it, you are able to select Walking Lunch and turn on Carved in Stone, the Iron Man setting. These builds that I'm going to be talking about here are also perfectly suited for any number of starting calamities, so that could be the recommended number, which is pretty typically what I see people playing at, or a 100 calamity start, which is the hardest possible start in the game. Now, I've tested these builds in both, so they should be fine there, and that should just work out without much issue. Note that I am going to be covering abilities, gear, transformations, and some variations that I consider high value for these builds, but keep in mind, you can flex what I'm saying here. I'm not going to be covering absolutely every variant, and there are a lot of ways that you can build against what I'm suggesting. Remember, I'm focusing on optimal, so I'm going to be telling you what I think is the absolute strongest, not just what is functional, right? There are going to be a lot of things that are part of the way there, but otherwise aren't the best of the best. I will also not be covering optimal history aspects, hook quests, or background options here because, one, they're nuanced, two, I would be saying the same thing in virtually every single build video, and I don't think that's helpful, and three, they're really hard to assemble, and some campaign settings, especially if you're not starting with legacy heroes, may not even give you the chance to do it. So I'll cover all that stuff in a later video, you don't have to worry about it now. Basically, I'll just go through that list at some point. So assume all of my heroes and anything I talk about are perfect, basically, from that perspective. I will also be assuming that you understand some basic concepts about the game, things like flanking, cover, what gray plane means, so on and so forth, because I don't want to have to explain all of that in here. I don't think that's going to be helpful, especially for the target audience for these builds. And yeah, I think that's everything I have to cover here. So as a reminder, do leave a comment with your ideas for other guides you'd like me to do, any builds you'd like me to cover in particular. You can like the video and subscribe if you want to see more. I've been very pleased with how the previous guides have been received, I suppose is the right way of saying it. They've been my most viewed Wildermyth videos by a lot, which has led me to want to continue to make more. I also think that I'm kind of uniquely situated to provide this kind of insight, given, the fact that I've done blind playthroughs of every campaign in the game on Walking Lunch with Carved in Stone enabled. So yeah, I think that's everything I've got here, so let's go ahead and dig into what we're covering on this particular run, or rather on this particular guide. So I'm going to be discussing what I consider to be one of the... I wanted to consider this early, right? I wanted to talk about this build early, and it's the Melee Mystic, and the reason is because it's an extremely unique build that I think is absolutely... I said this word already, but unique to Wildermyth. I think that this is a build that you will not see in other games that attempt to kind of emulate the style, and it's a combination of the fact that the abilities to support this sort of a build are present in this game, but also the way the combat works and the way that mystics work in general with the interfusion interactions. So we are touching on Melee Mystic, hell yeah. So this build is single target elimination taken to the absolute extreme. We've already talked about the Backstab Hunter build at this point, if you've been following the series at all, and that build is similar in the sense that it will assassinate and annihilate single enemy targets, but because of the way it works, it can actually kill multiple enemies in a turn, right? The Mystic melee build is different. It does not have the ability to get actions back and kill multiple enemies with its attack, it does singular massive hits that are capable of instantly killing the bosses of campaigns and capstone events without much issue. And there's a lot of really strong supporting abilities to go along with that. So, one of the big weaknesses of this build is the lack of cleave in the build. And there are some weapons that you can equip that give you a pseudo broad swipes effect on this build, but they don't scale with your potency and they don't get stronger in a way that's particularly meaningful. So I never recommend them here. I think they actually are a detriment compared to just stronger weapons. Similarly, you have some abilities. Obviously, you're a mystic. You have the ability to take any of the interfusion skills, right? And these are AoE abilities, but this is not where a majority of your damage is coming from in this build, especially. You're not taking any of the advanced interfusion skills or abilities, so you're not going to get the really powerful augmentations that more focused builds in the interfusion realm will have. Still, you do have them accessible to you, and there will be moments where you just need to use a ranged attack, so you're going to chuck a discus at an enemy or something like that. And it's going to hurt, right? I mean, you do a solid amount of damage with it, so fair enough. Those are all options here. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it. I don't think the build requires it. I do think this build also has a lot of unique features that are really cool, but we'll get into them when we get into them. Worth noting that this build picks up a ton of value overall from its abilities. This could be significant versatility or durability, which I think is, worthwhile, right? You have options based on how you want to build it. The other thing that's worth noting here is we're going to talk about the options, but I can't cover everything in a reasonable amount of time. There are going to be some skill options, things you could slap on an extra ability of Naturalist or Earth Scribe, and it changes the build slightly, and it gives you slightly different action economy. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about the core elements and the most important supporting elements, and beyond that, feel free to experiment. I think that you do not require 100% perfect builds to win in Walking Lunch with Carved in Stone turned on. You need around 85%. And that gives you quite a bit of freedom, actually, to explore different things and have, some flavor in your characters. They don't all have to be the exact same thing, which is nice. So I do actually really appreciate that about the difficulty of this game. So anyway, we are going to talk now about the core skills for this build. I want to switch to my other one first to show this off. Yeah, okay. So the number one core skill, and I'm going to call this mandatory for the build, is Vigor Flow. Vigor Flow basically augments your damage, your melee damage from physical attacks, specifically with each interfusion that you have. And it's important to keep in mind how this works. It says physical attacks. It actually also works with transformation melee attacks. Really what this means is melee attacks, okay? So when it says physical in this description, it can be slightly misleading. So obviously your weapon benefits, but I will be talking somewhat about magical melee attacks that do exist in this game that are actually some of the strongest scaling options for this build. So just don't get hung up on the wording here. The upgrade for this ability is also super important here. It is an additional augment of your damage. You do like an extra +1, which is worthwhile, but it also gives you a lot of speed for each interfusion, which is ridiculously good for mobility, okay? This is a surprising amount of engage and disengage potential to an otherwise very low mobility class. Okay, I know there are a few abilities that can assist with mobility here, but generally speaking, Mystic is going to be the one that lags behind. You don't have things like Zealous Leap conveniently accessible. You don't have things, Hunter's base movement speed, things like that. Mystic tends to be slow. But this completely changes that. Your character becomes lightning quick. Really strong. This is the only ability I consider completely mandatory for this build. you have to have Vigor Flow, or else you're not playing the Melee Mystic, period, end of story. That does mean that this is fairly easy to assemble in a new campaign, right? So if you're starting at level 1 without Legacy heroes, all you have to do is see Vigor Flow, and I think you can reasonably assemble a serviceable version of this build in that campaign. This is really good for like things like the Enduring War pre-made campaign, right, where you cannot start with any Legacy heroes. So that's an important consideration. There are two other skills that I consider core to this build, even though I don't consider them mandatory. The next one is Indignance Plus. So I mentioned previously that this build has no cleave, and there's a reason for that. The build just does not have the ability to... It doesn't have broad swipes, right? It doesn't have piercing attacks or something like that that scale with Vigor Flow. So you're essentially hitting an enemy once. And that's okay, because whatever you hit is going to die. It doesn't matter what it is, and it doesn't matter if you have flanking or anything. As long as you hit, it dies, period. And that doesn't even care about how many calamities the enemies have. We could be talking about a 100 calamity start, and as long as you can properly set up your interfusions for Vigor Flow to activate, you're going to hit in the first or second combat at least 22-ish damage, which kills anything that they're going to show you at that point. And it only gets better when you get, more potency, more whatever. So yeah, it's worth keeping in mind. Now that said, Indignance, especially Indignance Plus, which gives you additional range on the ability, is extremely valuable for this build for a number of reasons. It essentially answers the question of how do you kill multiple enemies. And one of the nice things about it is that it is true damage. Now, the game doesn't really explain what true damage is anywhere, but essentially it means it's damage that is taken and ignores armor and ignores warding. So that matters, and you kind of see it described up here, right? That matters for a few reasons, because there are many enemy types in the game that are low HP but heavily armored. Things like Horned Children in the deepest campaigns just get bodied by this, and it's really strong to be able to do that. This is also a primary component of where potency scaling comes from in this build, is the amount of damage you do here. You can see with this particular setup on this particular hero of mine, it's doing 5 true damage. That's just free damage that you get by walking to the enemy. Worth noting that I'm not even counting this free damage when I was talking about your melee attacks doing 22 or something out of the gate. You can get to the point where you're doing that 22, but you're also hitting everything around you for 5, and you can walk into range, out of range, back into range, and create some absolutely brutal interactions here, where you just do 15 AoE damage. How you path matters here because you want to kind of maximize how much you're hitting in terms of enemy units, especially when they cluster up. And that's one of the reasons I like the upgrade. The extra range goes from 1 range to 2 tiles. And that's nice because it gives you a lot of flexibility to clip a lot of extra enemies that you might normally be missing. This ability is nuts. It looks weak. I mean, you're only doing 5 true damage in an AoE, but when you think about how much movement there is and the fact that most enemies have to get in melee range to hit you, they're going to kill themselves in a lot of cases. This is kind of like Guardian or Paladin Plus or something on a warrior because it's kind of like a reaction strike. Enemies come close and they just take a hit, pretty much, but you don't actually swing, right? It's not quite the same, but it serves a similar purpose and it's really strong. So keep that in mind. The next ability I consider absolutely core is Open Mind. This is the other part of potency scaling for this build, and it's a passive that says you can interfuse with additional targets. It should be fairly obvious why this is important. Vigor Flow gives you bonus damage for each interfusion. Open Mind lets you interfuse with more things. This increases your max damage by a lot, and it also means that you get more targets for your potency. So you can get this number particularly high and have just an inordinate number of interfusions and kill enemies very quick. Now we're talking about optimized builds here, so keep in mind that I'm basically assuming you're going to be able to actually do these interfusions in order to scale your attack, and you want to do so fast. So those are the three core abilities I think here. There are some supporting ones that I want to touch on. You can see a couple here. One of them is, if I go to my other friend here, Soul Splitting. I really like this one because the Soul Splitting is essentially the defensive version of Vigor Flow. This can be good and bad. I like this because it makes your character a very big tank. Essentially, they do not die, but it does mean that if enemies focus fire you, they will destroy your interfusion targets, which can and will leave you with fewer targets. This, generally speaking, reduces your overall damage output. And it may not seem like it makes sense why, but it's because you're running out of scenery to interact with. Your scenery is dying because you're taking these hits, and ultimately that means that you're not doing as much in your consecutive attacks. Because, like Vigor Flow, I didn't mention this before, but it actually damages the interfused objects when you use the ability, right? And that's the tricky part. You want to kind of manage their HP, and if you're only using it for offense, then you don't really have to think about it that much. You can even do things like interfuse with fires on the ground and then just attack, and then the fires burn out because you attacked with them and they don't have much HP. It works out fine. I do like this, though, as a tanking option. It's pretty unlikely you would ever go the alternative of this build and just create super tank defensive Mystic and don't use Vigor Flow, because then what is this build really doing? If you're just wanting to turn this thing into a super tank, you may as well just use a warrior at that point, right? Or heck, even a hunter that has a lot of dodge is going to outperform it at that point. So it's not quite as good to lean too hard into Soul Splitting in my opinion. I don't consider it core. I do consider it a good supporting option. Long reach, I don't have it listed here at all, but obviously hitting at more range is going to be important. It's true for any melee build, so long reach plus is always an option to just hit things that are further away from you. Going back to my other version of this build, I think Compulsion is particularly useful here. It's also a really nice you can just kind of walk in with Compulsion unupgraded in your legacy, and then when you go into a campaign, you level up once, you can take Compulsion Plus, and this allows you to do silly things, like move enemies to you and then instantly kill them, or move enemies into range of your Indignance to kill them that way. It's also very flexible in that I think this is probably the best build to just slap Compulsion on, because you don't need that many things in your legacy, right? Your 5 abilities are what? Vigor Foe plus, Open Mind, and Indignance plus. And what I normally do here is I take Vigor Flow plus as my start, so that's 2. Open Mind, that's 3. And then I take Indignance without the upgrade, because I don't really need the extra range out of the gate. That's 4. So I can bring Compulsion pretty convincingly into the run, and then just upgrade depending on whatever is shown to me. And the nice thing about doing that is this ability is really handy. There's a lot of niche value in having the ability to move enemies, and it's hard to describe why it's really good. I've done some campaigns and shown it off a few times, and I recommend just looking at videos if you're not sure why anyone would ever want to use Compulsion. This ability it kind of breaks the game in a lot of ways. You can force enemies to walk into your warriors to trigger extra attacks, killing swaths of enemies earlier than they normally would die. You can move enemies away so that they don't even get an attack on you. You can send enemies one direction while your team walks another, and then the enemy loses sight of you and has to search and just kind of gets lost, and it's kind of like killing an enemy if they don't know where you are, right? So there's a lot of really interesting interactions, especially with this build, thanks to the presence of Indignance. So a strong recommendation for Compulsion. The only sort of advanced interfusion I want to mention, and I'm going to go over to one of my other heroes that's actually using it real quick. Naturalist gets an honorable mention here, right? Because when you interfuse with a tree, and you will interfuse with trees, it puts you into stealth. And when you're stealthed, this represents, you basically ignore armor, right? So there are some builds, some variants of this that are not, that would benefit from removing armor, right? Just so, okay, you get stealth, you can use that defensively or offensively, it's fine. So I'll give that an honorable mention. Otherwise, I don't think it's actually part of anything. I would never put it in the build normally, but if I saw it in the wild when making a character, sure, I'll grab it, fair enough. I do want to hit on gear next. So I feel bad about this, but gear is a really important part of this build, especially when you're trying to get to that quote-unquote 85% threshold. Most people who build this melee mystic, they really only get this thing to something like 50% power level. You're doing something like 20 damage at the end of chapter 5 with your attacks, and it's okay. But you're missing out on a lot. And the big thing here is gear matters. There's a very particular relic, artifact weapon specifically, that is, I would consider mandatory for this build, and it's really hard to get. And it's called, what you can see on screen here, the Swan Scepter. And you may ask why this is important. It's because it makes interfusion a free action. I grinded for a couple 100 hours to find this and only happened across it once. It's very hard to find. There's no guaranteed hit. You kind of just need to do it. I basically always make sure to bring, in any campaign I play, a mystic with me that is capable of being promoted and finding value from this scepter whenever possible. Because if you run into it, you want to put it to good use. It's obviously pretty good normal scepter stuff, spell damage, whatever, but making interfusion a free action, you swap to this scepter and then interfuse with every single possible piece of scenery around you. This hyperscales you with Vigor Flow Plus, and then hyperscales you with Soul Splitting if you're using it, and you immediately on turn 1 can just walk up to an enemy and punt them out of the universe for 45 damage or something like that. And that's 45 damage after factoring things like their armor or warding or whatever. So really strong. The other thing you'll see here that I'm using on this is the Empowered Bone Spear. I think this is the other mandatory part of this build. It's just so strong for a lot of different reasons. Fortunately, this one's a lot easier to get because there is an event that gets it for you. You want to get it upgraded in a follow-on, but it's worth it. The big thing that makes this so good is the fact that it is a melee weapon, particularly of type spear, that also provides potency, which matters. So it's good mix for everything, right? Potency benefits your random spells, it benefits Open Mind, particularly Indignance. It has 2 range, or 2.1 range specifically because it's a spear, and it does good damage. I essentially consider this mandatory. There is some elite tech interaction between these two weapons that I just discussed. You switch to Swan Scepter, you interfuse with as many things as it lets you, then you swap to Bone Spear. That's a free action. And the potency gives you an extra interfusion from the Open Mind ability, and then you use your swift action on that turn to get an extra interfusion, which adds even more damage. It's a slight piece of tech that you can use to eke out even higher damage numbers, and that's how you can go up to something like 48 or 50 damage with an attack. Pretty straightforward. I have another character that uses this weapon, but I don't have it on one of these mystics. I am going to point it out, though, as an option. From the All the Bones of Summer campaign, there is a piece of a weapon called the Thorn of the Fens. I give it an honorable shout out here. It's cool because it's a spear that gets flanking damage bonuses, which is unique and very strong in this case. The range is really nice of a spear here. It's one-handed. You love to see it. Flanking damage, because it's a multiplier, this, you have to give this some credit, because if you can set up the flank, then you can, I don't know, do something like 90 damage to an enemy, which is obscene. It is annoying to get this weapon, and you lose some of the benefit of things like the potency from Empowered Bone Spear. I think this is a close second, but worth considering for a variation of the build, just to add some variety, I think. So those are all the pieces of gear I really want to talk about as far as things that get saved in your legacy. Obviously, if you have extra arms, Spell Shard is the offhand of choice because it gives you extra potency. You can see on this particular character's offhand swap, I have +4, +1, that's 5 potency on one weapon set. So pretty good. Don't mind the fact that I'm currently wielding the Orphan Sword on this build. I was experimenting with things, it's fine. I don't consider it worth mentioning otherwise. though, so... let's talk a bit about transformations. I'm going to hit on the staples first because, whatever, it's fine. I don't think it's important. Basically, wings and tails. Generally speaking, wings are going to be good. Have wings if you can. You know, I don't have them on either of my instances of this build. Oh, I do have crow wings on Ringo, actually, so you can see. Crow wings, fine. Anything that gives you speed, dodge, some kind of value here. They're all basically the same. Hawk wings, crow wings, Draven wings. They have slight variations, but they're so close it doesn't really matter. You just want to have a set of them. They're good. I think Foxtail is probably the best tail for this particular build in general. It might be tempting to try a Scorpion Tail or something, but you're going to be performing a lot of actions already. It's really difficult to fit the Scorpion Tail action into your action economy, I find, in a practical sense. I did actually spend a little bit of time attempting to build one of these. You kind of see it here. I have it currently set as unplayable because I kind of felt it was bad and didn't get it up to Mythwalker level, but the action economy is a little bit trickier with the Scorpion Tail in tow. So keep that in mind. I think that it's much easier to just play with Fox. And yeah, that's the generic stuff. As for particular transformations that are good here, you'll notice I have a frog head. I think, perhaps surprisingly, that the frog head is one of the best transformations for this build. It's extremely good because it gives you tongue whip. You can see it here on the right hand side of my screen here. Basically, it yoinks an enemy to you as a swift action, which, when you think about it, is pretty crazy because this moves an enemy close to you. It procs guardians from adjacent warriors. It moves enemies into your indignance fields, right? And then it also puts them in range of your attacks. Really strong overall, and that's on a swift action. I think the frog head is the strongest head skill choice for this particular build for just that reason. There's some others that are okay, but this one I think is the best. Also, this is a really cool way to make this transformation good, I think. So I'm a big fan of this. Before I get into too many other transformations, though, especially the other one I really want to show off, I want to just mention generically that you really want something that scales with potency as your primary attack here if you're not going to be using the Bone Spear. Certainly the Bone Spear is good. I think you should have it no matter what because it gives you potency. But having a payoff transformation in your right hand is usually where you're going to get the value, right? So you're carrying the Bone Spear to get that 4 potency, and then you have the payoff in the form of your attack from your transformed arm. This is usually the way I would recommend this, right? I think that usually pays off significantly stronger. So there's that. You also really, really want the Swan Scepter, so you only want to take one arm transformation on this build. Never take double arm transforms. This makes some transformations awkward/bad. There aren't very many options here that I consider particularly optimal, though you can kind of play with whatever you want. You can create some passable variants of this with virtually any transformation otherwise, so fair enough. That said, we are going to talk about this one right here, Shadow Transform. I think that Shadow Transformation is the best choice here. It is unbelievable sustain, and it's unbelievable scaling for this build. It has a unique and completely unlisted ability on all of its aspects here, where there's any enemy that is adjacent to Shadow characters loses 2 warding. And that is important, 1, because it supports your friends, but 2, because there's an ability on the right arm called Harvest. And you can upgrade this with Harvest Plus to make it scale even more. This scales with bonus damage and potency, and it heals the character by 1 HP for each shadow limb they have when they kill an enemy. And since every attack auto-kills every enemy that is attacked, this is free to proc, essentially. The other important thing, and this is why I mentioned that physical magic damage nonsense before, this attack deals magic damage, which means that it deals damage against an enemy's warding and actually just freely ignores their armor in most cases. So that's pretty exceptional. This does work with Vigor Flow, So even though it says physical attacks, it does absolutely scale just perfectly fine. Love to see it. These numbers can get astronomically high. It's very common for me to hit enemies on the order of 48 damage with this once I have swapped fully in interfused with everything, swapped back to potency, and then take a swing on an enemy. It is incredible. So that's pretty awesome. This also is a lot of sustain, which means you don't need soul splitting, which I think is really valuable. It means that you can bring other support abilities like compulsion and feel good about it. I like that a lot about this variant of the build, the fact that it can keep itself alive since you're always getting, in this case, 1, 2, 3 health back every hit, which is good, especially since this person has 14 health overall. Very tanky build, all things considered. So, really good. The other nice little touch here is that, where is it? You get +1 speed just for being a shadow and interfused person. It's nice. Extra speed is good. So yeah. I don't have a build with the next transformation configured, but I do want to talk about it nonetheless. I do have one. Wolftouched gets an honorable mention here for a number of reasons. It's a functional alternative with a potency scaling melee attack. The melee attack on the arms, and don't mind that I'm looking at a hunter that doesn't have an arm here, I'm just kind of using it to show some of the skills. The arms have water stunt, which means that if you crit with a stunt, you can hit again and hit multiple enemies, which lets you kind of go mad with power. Again, keep in mind you only want the one arm, not both. Doing both arms is making your character worse, frankly, so be mindful of that. The legs also give bonus speed over default human legs, which is nice for the same reason it's good on Shadow. And the last kind of benefit here is that you get the swift action wolf bite on the head, which does benefit from the vigor flow. So you get some kind of crazy action economies here. You're going to end up inevitably giving up some of your interfusions because you're using swift actions for other things, but at the same time, you get more hits. This means that you can hit enemies and kill multiple enemies in a round, which is nice, or you can just completely annihilate an enemy. The scaling is not quite as good with this as it is with the others, because you don't get that magic damage nonsense of Shadow, and since you're only using one of the arms. Worth noting, if we go back to, where is he? Shadow, you can get Harvest Plus on a Shadow character with only one arm transformed. Something like, where is it? Wolf. I'm pretty confident you can't see the Wolf Frenzy upgrade if you only have one arm transformed. I think you need both arms transformed to get that upgrade, which means that you do lose a little bit of scaling here. So if I'm wrong on that, someone yell at me in a comment and I'll pin it and it's fine. But I'm pretty confident you can't get that ability here to increase the scaling unless you transform both arms, which I do consider very incorrect for this build. So that's another consideration. Let's see. The last one I do want to hit on is, if I go back to my lower level dude that I haven't actually worked on in a while, I think it deserves an honorable mention, the gem transformation, because the eye gives you stunt chance, and stunting is nice here. So there's that. You can, if you want to just give up on the scepter, go for the shield, which is damage reduction and stunt chance as well, giving you up to 12. And then you just carry your actually good weapon on your other hand, and it's fine. It could be the sword. The sword is nice because of this potency scaling from it, and you can run this with gem and it's not too bad. I think it's fine. I think it's a little less preferable compared to the others we've talked about, the wolf and the shadow, but at the same time, it is quite serviceable. I think it's the third best for sure here. So there's that. Lastly, I'm going to hit on pets a little bit here. I don't have too much to say. Some of them are going to be obvious. I want to give Critter a shout out because you do have interfusion abilities that mean that the range is beneficial, and the Critter is good. I actually have someone who has Critter. Let me pull it up. Yeah, Critter. Critter's good melee accuracy is the important thing here, right? And I like the melee accuracy a lot because you can't afford to be missing on those characters. So if you have the ability and want to take Critter, that's cool. That's important. Let's see. I do have on one of them. Where are you? There you are. Essentially, I value survivability on this character quite a bit as well, so both the duck and the rat are good choices for dodge block. Rat is unfortunately inferior to duck universally, but the nice thing about rat is it's easier to get if you're a goofball. Also, the devs have hinted at that this may be buffed at some point in time, since it's currently inferior to duck overall, and if rat gets buffed, well, then rat becomes excellent in its own right if it's comparable. Plus he's cute, so why not? So those are both good for defensive setups. Note that this particular variant of the character that I have on screen right now, with Soul Splitting and the Rat and a Greatsword, is particularly defensive. The Greatsword is neat because you get melee accuracy and block. This dude is pretty tanky. I designed him that way because he's kind of more of a carry for bad characters in other runs, or runs that I'm leveling up. Plus, it's some variety, which is fun. So, we go over here. Avenger is obvious. It is weird getting Avenger on a non-warrior, but it is possible. You simply have to have the warrior die in the combat that gives you Avenger, and have your target be the only other character who can take a pet. It works out pretty well. It's pretty obvious. Also, another obvious one, I give everyone a Draven Bird. Sure, man, why not? I consider that part of the optimals, right? Everyone gets a Draven Bird. It's fine. And yeah, I think that's everything I needed to cover here. I managed to keep this from going too long. I personally think that this is probably the Mystic's strongest build. It's capable of one-shotting final bosses of campaigns, even on the highest difficulty with max calamities, which is pretty unbelievable. It has virtually no setup. If you properly configure this with the Swan Scepter, you can set up all in one turn with no complications in any area, because there's always going to be enough scenery, and then just pretty much annihilate something. Enemies that destroy scenery are annoying. I usually kill them first with this build. Alternatively, though, you do have options for creating scenery on Mystic if needed, so there's also that. I think this build's awesome. That said, I do think it lacks the jack-of-all-trades benefits that other Mystic builds have, and we will cover other Mystic builds. I do not think this is the only one you should run. There are others that are much better at certain other things, certain other tasks. So you lose a lot of that flexibility, though, here. You have the abilities, right? So, I mean, you go into combat, you have the ability to use these default interfusion abilities, but you don't get any of the advanced ones. Some of those advanced ones are pretty epic. The other nice thing is that it's fairly easy to configure this. You just see Vigor Flow in a run, and voila, you can start this character. It's much easier than some other builds that maybe require 2 skills at the same time for them to start, kicking off and being good. So that's nice. That said, even though it's easy to assemble on a new Mystic, it's very hard to optimize because of the hard reliance on Swan Scepter in order to reach the top tier levels of damage here. So that's important to keep in mind. It's worth noting as well that it excels against any enemy species, though I think the Shadow variant, the one that I'm hovering over on screen, which I think is the most powerful variant by a long shot, is particularly brutal against Morthagi, because magic damage, and Thrixel because it denies their warding. So, worth noting that it's just really good against those two in particular, even though the others will die to it all the same. And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I have for you today. We will be back at some point with the next build, and we will go from there. So, hey, thanks a lot for watching this. I do really appreciate your time. As always, you can give the video a like or a dislike if you want. You can subscribe to the channel if you want to see more, and stay tuned for what's next. Take care, folks.